It was a crisp, sunny morning, and Alana Williams walked briskly down the city's bustling streets. She was a bright, kind-hearted 24-year-old, carrying herself with a quiet confidence. Despite her youth, Alana was well aware of the complexities of life in the city. Her mother, Judge Lila Harrington, had raised her to be proud, resilient, and never afraid to be herself. Alana knew that prejudice was real. She'd seen it in countless ways, but she never imagined it would strike her so cruelly today. As she crossed an intersection, distracted by her thoughts, she barely noticed a small traffic sign she'd overlooked. She was jolted back to reality by the sharp sound of a police siren. 2 white police officers stepped out of their squad car, their eyes narrowing as they looked her over. "Ma'am, stop right there," the taller of the 2 barked, his tone already laden with authority and suspicion. Alana paused, a chill prickling her spine. She kept her hands visible, her heart beginning to pound as she searched their faces for any hint of understanding. Instead, she found hostility and, in a way she couldn't shake, disdain. "I'm sorry, officer," she began calmly, her voice soft. "I didn't realize I'd made a mistake." The second officer sneered, glancing at her with a look that made her feel small. "Didn't realize? Huh. You people never seem to realize until it's too late." The words hit her like a slap. "Excuse me?" she asked, more surprised than anything, her voice shaky with a mixture of fear and indignation. But the officers were unbothered. They began asking her rapid-fire questions, insinuating accusations, questioning her reasons for being in that part of town. Each question became more invasive, more accusatory, as if she were a criminal under interrogation. Alana's stomach churned as she struggled to keep her composure. She felt her fear growing, a sinking dread that had nothing to do with a traffic violation. She tried to speak, to reason with them, but her words were cut off, twisted, dismissed. Other pedestrians looked on, some pitying, others afraid, but no one dared to interfere. One officer stepped closer, his hand hovering over his holstered weapon, his expression daring her to resist. "Are you resisting, ma'am?" he asked with a tone that was both mocking and menacing. The words stung. Alana could barely keep her voice steady. "No, sir. I'm not resisting. I'm just trying to explain." But the officers wouldn't let her. Her explanations were ignored, her respectful tone dismissed. They took her silence as guilt, her hesitation as defiance. In their eyes, her every move was suspicious, every word another excuse. Frustration turned into anger, then melted into fear, as she realized that her words, her respect, even her humanity seemed invisible to them. Tears gathered in her eyes as the officers pushed her roughly to her knees on the cold concrete, ordering her to remain silent. The humiliation and despair cut deep, and she could only look around in desperation, silently begging anyone to intervene, to see her as a person deserving of compassion, of help, of basic human respect. But no one moved. A tear slid down her cheek as she looked up at the officers, her voice breaking as she whispered, "Please. I didn't do anything wrong." But to them, her plea was nothing more than a confirmation of their assumptions. The crowd dispersed, leaving Alana alone on her knees, her spirit and pride shattered. She felt smaller and more powerless than she had ever felt before. Every ounce of dignity stripped from her as she knelt there, at the mercy of men who saw her only as a problem. Yet, in that moment of pain and degradation, something shifted within Alana. She thought of her mother, Judge Harrington, A woman who had faced many obstacles but had always taught her to hold her head high. To demand justice. And so, through the pain, Alana's heart steeled itself, resolving that if she survived this moment, she would find a way to make this injustice known. She would ensure no one else suffered the way she was suffering now. As the officers prepared to take her in, they had no idea they were laying the foundation for their own reckoning. For this was not the end of Alana's story, it was the beginning. The morning air was crisp, filled with the city's familiar rhythm of hurried footsteps, honking horns, and distant conversations. Alana Williams, a young black woman with a radiant smile and a gentle spirit, was on her way to meet a friend for brunch. The city was her home, a place she knew well, filled with memories and people who made her feel alive. Today, however, she felt a bit anxious. An important job interview awaited her later, one she'd been preparing for weeks. Deep in thought, she crossed the street, unaware she'd missed a pedestrian signal in her rush. A sudden, piercing siren shattered her thoughts. She turned, startled, as a police car pulled up beside her. Two officers stepping out, their faces hardened with authority. Alana felt a familiar knot of unease tighten in her stomach. But she took a deep breath, reminding herself that she'd done nothing wrong. She faced the officers calmly, her heart beating faster as they approached. "Ma'am, you're going to need to stay right where you are," the taller officer commanded, his tone colder than the morning air. "Excuse me, officer," Alana responded, her voice steady, trying to mask her nervousness. "Is something wrong?" The second officer, a burly man with a sneer that seemed permanently etched into his face, looked her over, his gaze filled with something unsettling. "You just crossed without waiting for the light. People get hurt that way," he said, each word laced with a subtle edge. "What's the hurry?" Alana's heart raced. It was just a minor mistake, one almost everyone made at some point. "I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to," she began, choosing her words carefully. "I was distracted. I didn't realize." "Oh. Didn't realize?" The taller officer folded his arms, stepping closer. "That's convenient." She opened her mouth to respond, but his tone stopped her. She noticed the way his eyes scanned her, a look that was far from neutral. There was a hardness, a judgment, as if he'd already decided what kind of person she was. "Where are you headed?" "Anyway," the second officer demanded, his voice probing and intrusive. I'm meeting a friend nearby," she replied, her voice growing softer. She tried to keep her tone respectful, but inside, a storm was brewing. What was supposed to be a minor inconvenience was turning into an ordeal. One where her every move, every word, seemed to add fuel to their suspicion. "A friend," he repeated, skepticism dripping from his voice. "You got ID?" Alana hesitated, reaching slowly into her bag. She handed over her ID, watching as they examined it like it was a piece of evidence, passing it back and forth, looking for something, anything, that might incriminate her. "You don't seem to be from around here," the tall officer said with a smirk, though her ID clearly displayed her address within city limits. Her heart sank. She could feel the glances of people passing by, sensing their curiosity but also their reluctance to intervene. Alana felt the weight of their eyes, the sympathy in some and indifference in others, as if they were all too familiar with this kind of scene. "Is this necessary?" Alana asked softly, struggling to maintain her composure. "I really didn't mean any harm." The second officer's face twisted with irritation. "You don't get to question us," he snapped, his voice now a low, dangerous whisper. "You don't get to explain yourself." Her cheeks flushed with a mixture of humiliation and fear. Her mind raced with thoughts of her mother. Judge Lila Harrington, a woman who had always championed the rights of the marginalized and instilled in her daughter a strong sense of justice. She could almost hear her mother's voice in her head, urging her to stay calm, to hold her head high. But in this moment, Alana felt anything but strong. "Ma'am," the first officer's voice cut through her thoughts, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "Are you resisting?" A chill ran through her body. She swallowed hard, her voice wavering. "No, sir. I'm just trying to understand why this is happening." Her words seemed to anger him further. He moved closer, his presence looming. "Why don't you just cooperate?" "Huh. You people always have excuses." The words struck her like a blow. "You people." She felt a familiar, bitter taste in her mouth, the words echoing the deep-rooted prejudice she'd encountered her entire life. She'd learned to brush off remarks, to rise above the glances and comments. But this was different. This was authority bearing down on her, twisting her words, stripping her dignity, reducing her to a stereotype. The officer's hand moved to his belt, and Alana's stomach clenched as she saw his fingers graze the weapon holstered there. "Get on your knees," he ordered coldly. The world seemed to slow down, the air thick with disbelief. Alana's pride and sense of self-worth battled against the overwhelming fear that was coursing through her. She opened her mouth to protest, to explain that she was a human being, that she deserved respect, but the words caught in her throat. I didn't do anything wrong," she managed to say, her voice barely a whisper. "You think we care?" the second officer taunted, a twisted smile playing on his lips. Feeling utterly defeated, Alana sank slowly to her knees, the cold concrete biting into her skin. Tears blurred her vision, and a single tear rolled down her cheek, a silent testimony to the humiliation she felt. She lowered her head, willing herself not to cry, but her body betrayed her as silent sobs racked her frame. Around her, the city continued, indifferent to her suffering. She glanced up briefly, her teary eyes searching the crowd for any sign of help, any face willing to step forward. But the people looked away, their fear of authority overpowering their empathy. As she knelt there, hands trembling, something shifted within her. This moment, this cruel display of power, would not break her. Alana thought of her mother's words, "We are stronger than they believe. We are worth more than they know." The pain of her humiliation was sharp, but beneath it simmered a quiet determination. With every fiber of her being, Alana promised herself that she would survive this. And not only survive, she would rise. Her mother's voice filled her mind, a comforting strength anchoring her in the storm. This wouldn't end here. Not like this. And though the officers couldn't see it, a spark ignited in her heart, one that would light a fire they would come to regret. This was just the beginning. Alana's mind spun as she knelt on the cold, gritty concrete. The city lights blurred through her tears, creating a disorienting haze as she tried to process what was happening. The officers stood over her, towering like shadows, their expressions impassive. She was used to being overlooked. But this was something else, a deliberate act to remind her of where they thought she belonged. As she knelt there, trembling with a mixture of rage and fear, memories surfaced, unbidden, of her mother's unwavering strength. Judge Lila Harrington had built a reputation as one of the most respected and fair-minded judges in the city. Alana remembered watching her mother handle complex cases. Always calm, always prepared, fighting tirelessly for those who needed a voice. Lila had taught Alana that dignity and respect were not things to be earned, they were owed to everyone. Yet here she was, Her dignity stolen by men who saw her as nothing more than a problem to be subdued. The shorter officer crouched down, peering into her face with a mocking grin. "Now look at you," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not so tough now. Are you?" Alana clenched her jaw, biting back the angry retort that hovered on her lips. She knew that any response, any flicker of defiance, would only make things worse. Her heart pounded so hard she could feel it in her throat, her pulse a constant reminder of her vulnerability. She glanced around once more, but the people on the street seemed to dissolve into the distance, unwilling to make eye contact, unwilling to intervene. The taller officer spoke, his voice sharp and authoritative, slicing through the silence. "You're going to stay right there until we're done with you," he said, his tone as cold as steel. "And you'll keep your mouth shut if you know what's good for you." Alana's breath came in short, shallow gasps as she struggled to regain control. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to fight back, to do something, anything, to reclaim her autonomy. But she knew that any sign of resistance, even the slightest protest, could be used against her. She was trapped, ensnared by a system that saw her as guilty simply because she was black and dared to exist in a space they believed wasn't hers. The officers' voices faded into the background as Alana retreated inward, focusing on the one thing she could control, her own resolve. She wouldn't let them break her spirit, no matter how much they tried to demean her. She was more than their perception of her, she was more than the role they tried to force upon her. In the silence, a faint memory surfaced. She was a child, maybe 8 or 9, watching her mother prepare for a case late into the night. Lila had looked up from her papers, noticing Alana's curious gaze, and had said, "Never let anyone tell you that you are less than who you are. Alana, your worth isn't theirs to decide." Those words echoed in her mind now, a lifeline pulling her back from the edge of despair. She straightened slightly, her knees still on the ground but her back a little less bowed, her spirit a little less shattered. She would survive this moment, and somehow, she would turn this pain into something powerful. One of the officers noticed her change in posture and frowned, as if sensing her inner defiance. He reached down and grabbed her arm roughly, pulling her to her feet. "Enough with the dramatics," he sneered. "You're coming with us." Alana stumbled but caught herself, her legs shaky from the stress and cold. She stood between the two officers, her head held high despite everything. They might be able to control her body, but they couldn't control her mind. They couldn't touch her resilience. As they led her toward the squad car, a passerby finally stepped forward, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a hesitant smile. "Excuse me, officers," she called, her voice trembling. Is everything okay?" The officers exchanged a look, annoyance flashing in their eyes. "Move along." "Ma'am," one of them snapped, his tone dismissive. "This doesn't concern you." The woman hesitated, glancing at Alana with sympathy. Alana felt a surge of gratitude for this stranger's small act of courage. It wasn't much, but it was something, an acknowledgement of her humanity, a reminder that she wasn't completely alone. As the officers ushered her into the back of the car, Alana caught a glimpse of the woman, her face a mixture of frustration and helplessness. Their eyes met for a brief moment, and in that gaze, Alana saw something that gave her strength, a silent promise that her story wouldn't end here. That there were people who saw her, who cared, even if they felt powerless to help. The squad car door slammed shut, trapping her in the cold, sterile darkness of the back seat. She could hear the officers' muffled voices up front, talking as if she wasn't there, as if she were an object instead of a person. The car started moving, and Alana's mind raced. the reality of her situation settling over her like a heavy shroud. But amidst the fear, a spark of determination grew. They were taking her to the station, planning to process her like a criminal. But she wasn't going to let this experience define her. She thought of the many people her mother had defended, the countless lives she had changed by refusing to back down. Alana knew that her mother would stop at nothing to seek justice, not just for her daughter, but for the community she served. And in that knowledge, Alana found solace. A reassurance that she would have her day to speak, to tell her story. The car continued down the dimly lit streets, and Alana sat quietly, her heart calm but resolute. This wasn't the end, it was the beginning of a fight she was more than ready to take on. They had reduced her to her knees, but they hadn't taken her strength, her pride, or her will. She took a deep breath, grounding herself in that inner strength, a fire that would only grow. In this darkness, she found clarity, a purpose. She wasn't just fighting for herself, she was fighting for all those who had suffered in silence, who had been overlooked and undervalued. And as the city lights blurred past, Alana knew one thing with certainty: this moment would not define her, but it would transform her the next morning. Judge Lila Harrington sat in her chambers, preparing for a full day of hearings. Her mind was focused, her attention sharp, as she reviewed case files with practiced ease. Despite her powerful position, Lila was known for her warmth and fairness, a judge who understood the real struggles behind each case. She had spent years building a reputation not only for upholding the law but for standing firmly against injustice in all its forms. Lila had yet to hear from Alana that morning, which was unusual. Her daughter was diligent about staying in touch, especially on days when they couldn't have breakfast together. Brushing off a hint of worry, she decided to give Alana a call, hoping to hear her daughter's familiar, cheerful voice. But the call went straight to voicemail, and a sense of unease settled over her. Just as she was about to continue with her work, her phone buzzed again. This time with an unexpected caller, the chief of police, an old acquaintance. Lila's stomach tightened as she answered, her voice calm but weary. "Judge Harrington, I thought it best you heard this from me," the chief began, his tone unusually measured. "There was an incident involving your daughter, Alana." The words struck her like a blow. Lila's mind raced, the steady composure she was known for slipping momentarily. "What happened?" she asked, keeping her tone steady, though her heart pounded in her chest. "She was detained last night by 2 officers after a minor incident. There seems to have been a misunderstanding." A misunderstanding. Lila felt a surge of anger at the feeble attempt to downplay what she sensed was far more serious. "And where is she now?" she demanded, her voice turning steely. "She's at the precinct. But I assure you, Judge, we're handling it." Without another word, Lila hung up and rose from her desk, gathering her things with a calm efficiency that belied the storm brewing within her. Her daughter, her Alana, detained like a criminal. It was unthinkable. And yet, deep down, she knew this wasn't just about a misunderstanding. She had seen too many cases where mistakes turned into lifelong traumas for young black men and women caught in the crosshairs of prejudice. Minutes later, Lila arrived at the precinct, her presence commanding attention the moment she stepped through the doors. She moved with purpose, her expression unreadable but intense, as officers and staff parted to let her pass. Sensing the gravity of her arrival, at the desk, she found one of the officers who had detained her daughter, the shorter, sneering one she would later learn was named Officer Reed. He seemed startled by her sudden appearance, his bravado faltering under her gaze. "I'm here for Alana Williams," she stated, her voice firm, leaving no room for argument. Officer Reed looked uneasy, but quickly masked it with a forced smile. "Ah, Judge Harrington," he said, attempting to sound casual. "I was just—" "Save it," she cut him off, her tone sharper than he expected. "Take me to my daughter. Now." Reluctantly, Reed led her down a corridor to a holding cell, where Alana sat on a cold metal bench, looking tired but unbroken. When Alana looked up and saw her mother, a flood of relief softened her face, though her eyes still held the shadows of her experience. "Mom," she murmured, her voice barely a whisper. Lila approached her, and without a word, wrapped her daughter in a fierce hug. Drawing strength from the embrace, she pulled back, examining Alana's face, noting the faint bruise on her wrist and the exhaustion in her eyes. The sight only fueled her anger. "Are you okay?" Lila asked softly, brushing a strand of hair from Alana's face. Alana nodded, though the pain in her eyes spoke volumes. I'm okay. But Mom, it was awful. They didn't see me as a person, just as a problem." Lila's jaw tightened, the words igniting a fire within her. She turned back to Officer Reed, her gaze icy. "I want a full report on what happened. And I want it now. This treatment is unacceptable." Reed shifted uncomfortably, glancing around as though looking for support. "Judge, we were just doing our job. She crossed the street illegally, and we had reason to believe she was acting suspiciously." "Suspiciously?" Lila repeated, her voice dripping with disbelief. "For crossing the street?" Her tone cut through the silence like a knife. "Is that the story you're going with?" He hesitated, sensing the weight of his words, but quickly forced a nod, his pride still clinging to his authority. "Yes, ma'am. We acted according to protocol." Lila's voice turned colder. "Then I'm sure you won't mind if I review those protocols myself." She gestured to another officer nearby, her gaze intense. "I want the body cam footage of the incident. Now." As they complied, Alana remained silent, but her heart swelled with a newfound strength. Seeing her mother take command of the situation reminded her of the resilience and power she herself possessed. The officers, once brimming with arrogance, now looked uneasy under Lila's scrutiny, their confidence dwindling with each passing second. When the footage played, the small crowd of officers that had gathered around watched in tense silence. The screen showed Alana's fear, her respectful tone, her attempts to comply, contrasted sharply with the officer's taunts and aggressive body language. Reed's sneering expression, his belittling tone, his hand hovering near his weapon as Alana knelt on the pavement, all of it was laid bare. Lila watched, her face a mask of controlled anger. When the footage ended, she looked at Reed, her voice barely a whisper but seething with restrained fury. "This is how you serve and protect?" Reed opened his mouth, scrambling for an excuse, but Lila raised a hand to silence him. "I don't want to hear it. This isn't just about my daughter, it's about every person who has been mistreated by people like you." Her words rang out, resonating through the room with a strength that left no one untouched. Turning to Alana, she took her hand. "Let's go," she said, her tone softer now, reassuring. As they walked out of the precinct, Lila could feel the eyes of everyone in the room on them. She held her head high, her determination unshakable, her mind already turning over how she would take this injustice to the highest levels. She would not let this be swept under the rug. This was a call to action, a reminder that justice was not just a word but a duty, one she was ready to fight for with everything she had. When they reached the courthouse steps, Alana looked up at her mother, her face a mixture of relief and newfound strength. "Mom," she whispered, her voice steady. "I want to speak out. I don't want anyone else to go through this." Lila nodded, a proud smile touching her lips. "Then we will. Together." In that moment, Alana felt a shift within her. She wasn't just a victim, she was a voice. A force ready to stand for something larger than herself. And by her side was her mother. A woman who would stop at nothing to bring justice to those who had been silenced. This wasn't the end, it was the beginning of a battle for dignity, equality, and respect. As they stood together, side by side, they knew they had a long fight ahead. But they also knew they weren't alone. Their resolve was a beacon, a light against the darkness of prejudice. And together, they would face whatever came next. Ready to hold the world accountable, Lila led Alana out of the precinct, her arm protectively around her daughter's shoulders. But as they reached the courthouse steps, her fury only grew. The injustice Alana had suffered wasn't just a personal attack, it was a grim reminder of the prejudice and abuse countless people faced daily, buried beneath polite platitudes and ignored complaints. But this time, there would be no forgetting. No sweeping under the rug. This was her daughter. Her Alana. Who had been treated like a criminal for simply crossing the street. As they entered her chambers, Lila turned to Alana, her face softening but her eyes still blazing. "Are you absolutely sure about this, Alana? Once we step forward, we can't turn back. You'll be under scrutiny. And this won't be an easy fight." Alana held her mother's gaze, her face determined despite the exhaustion in her eyes. "I'm sure. Mom. What they did to me, it wasn't just humiliating. It was dehumanizing. I don't want anyone else to go through that." She paused, her voice breaking slightly. But she steadied herself. "We have to do this." Lila nodded, pride swelling in her heart. She could see Alana's strength, her fierce spirit, and it only fueled her own resolve. "Then we're in this together," she said firmly, taking Alana's hand. "I'll make sure every last detail is brought to light." Lila moved with purpose, filing an official complaint and requesting immediate access to all documentation, body cam footage, and disciplinary records of the officers involved. As the judge, she had access to every layer of the justice system, and she was determined to use every tool at her disposal. Within hours, word began to spread. Rumors of Judge Harrington's daughter being mistreated by the police circulated through the courthouse, the precinct, and even the mayor's office. News outlets started calling, eager for a story on the prominent judge taking a stand against the police department. It wasn't long before the precinct's Internal Affairs Division announced a formal investigation. The officers, once secure in their authority, now found themselves under scrutiny, their every action dissected. Meanwhile, Alana's story gained traction online. People shared their own experiences of discrimination and mistreatment. Stories that had been ignored or minimized. Until now, the hashtag Justice for Alana started trending, igniting conversations around the country. Alana felt both exposed and empowered, her vulnerability transforming into a strength she hadn't realized she possessed. The police department attempted damage control, issuing a statement describing the incident as an unfortunate misunderstanding and pledging to review internal procedures. But for Alana and her mother, these empty words only strengthened their resolve. This wasn't just about a review or a misunderstanding, it was about accountability. About a culture that allowed officers like Reed and his partner to abuse their power without fear of consequence. Lila spent long hours preparing a case, combing through every incident in the officers' records that hinted at a pattern of prejudice. She called in experts, contacted civil rights organizations, and worked late into the night. her mind a steel trap as she gathered evidence. She wasn't simply Alana's mother, she was a judge with the power to bring real change. When the preliminary hearing arrived, the courtroom was packed. Reporters and supporters filling the benches, their eyes trained on the woman who had become a symbol of hope for those who had suffered in silence. Alana sat beside her mother, her head held high, feeling the weight of countless people's stories resting on her shoulders. The officers arrived, escorted by their lawyer, a man with a polished demeanor who projected an air of calm. He was confident, smug even, as though this were merely a nuisance that would soon be dismissed. Lila began her opening statement, her voice steady. But there was an underlying passion that electrified the room. "This case is about more than a single incident," she said, her gaze sweeping the room. "It's about a system that condones prejudice, that permits officers to use force without accountability. My daughter was humiliated, mistreated, and dehumanized not because she posed any threat, but because of the color of her skin. This isn't just about Alana, it's about every individual who has been targeted, harassed, and hurt by those sworn to protect them." She presented the footage from that night, playing it frame by frame. The court watched as Alana's calm demeanor was met with hostility, as her attempts to comply were ignored, as her fear and respect were twisted into excuses for aggression. The raw truth of it hung in the air. Every word, every gesture a testament to the abuse of power. The officer's lawyer rose, his face impassive. He began to argue that the officers had followed protocol, that Alana's actions had appeared erratic and that the officers had merely ensured public safety. But Lila's cross-examination was unyielding, her questions precise, each one revealing another layer of bias and contradiction in their statements. The turning point came when she presented the officers' disciplinary records, uncovering multiple complaints from others who had faced similar treatment, complaints that had been quietly dismissed, filed away without follow-up. It painted a picture of a pattern, a history of unchecked abuse hidden beneath layers of bureaucracy. The atmosphere in the courtroom shifted, the air tense as people began to understand the gravity of what had been allowed to happen. Alana's case was no longer an isolated incident but part of a larger, darker truth. As the trial continued, supporters and media rallied around Alana and her mother, demanding accountability. Alana's story became a catalyst for others, sparking protests, debates, and calls for reform in cities across the country. She received messages from strangers sharing their stories, people who thanked her for speaking out, for giving them hope that change was possible. Throughout it all, Alana remained strong, drawing strength from her mother's unwavering support and her own resolve. She could feel the tide turning, a movement building, one that was beyond her. Beyond her mother, it was a movement for justice, dignity, and respect for all. The officers, once so smug and confident, began to show cracks, their composure slipping as the evidence mounted against them. The weight of their actions, once hidden by authority, was now a spotlight exposing every flaw, every misstep, every moment they'd used their power to hurt instead of protect. In the closing arguments, Lila stood once more, her voice a quiet force. "This isn't about revenge, it's about accountability. It's about ensuring that those who are given the power to protect us are held to the highest standard, that they are reminded of the responsibility that comes with that power." She paused, looking directly at the jury. Alana's story is one of many. It is time for change. The courtroom sat in silence, the weight of her words settling over them. Alana felt a surge of emotion, knowing that whatever the verdict, they had already achieved something powerful. They had given a voice to the voiceless, ignited a call for change that would resonate far beyond this room. As they left the courthouse, side by side. Alana looked up at her mother. Gratitude and pride filling her heart. They hadn't just fought for justice, they had fought for dignity. For respect. For the right to exist without fear. And they knew that. Together. They would continue this fight. For as long as it took. As the trial continued. The tension inside the courtroom grew thick. Almost tangible. Judge Lila Harrington sat beside Alana. Her presence a beacon of strength for her daughter and everyone else in the room who had suffered similar injustices. With every passing day, Lila's resolve only grew stronger. She was no longer just a judge or a mother, she had become a symbol of justice for the voiceless. But as confident as Lila was, Alana was beginning to feel the weight of the trial press down on her. Sitting in that courtroom, reliving the trauma through testimonies, videos, and cross-examinations, was exhausting. The cameras, the reporters, the endless questions, it all felt overwhelming. But each time she thought about stepping back, she looked at her mother and remembered the countless messages she'd received from people who were rooting for her, who saw her as a symbol of hope. It kept her going. On the third day of the trial, the defense team for Officers Reed and Collins began their cross-examination, determined to undermine Alana's credibility. They questioned her intentions, suggesting that she was exaggerating the event for attention, that her erratic behavior had left the officers with no choice but to respond the way they did. Alana sat on the witness stand, her heart pounding as the defense lawyer fired off question after question. Each question felt like an attack, an attempt to paint her as irrational, dishonest, or manipulative. "Ms. Williams," the lawyer said, his voice smooth but cold, "are you saying that you, a young woman alone at night, did not feel any responsibility to cooperate fully with the officers? Perhaps your refusal to be compliant heightened their response?" Alana took a deep breath, steadying herself. "I never refused to comply," she said firmly, keeping her voice as calm as possible. "I answered their questions. I showed them my ID. I was respectful. But from the start, they treated me like a criminal." The lawyer gave a faint, mocking smile. "So you're claiming that all of this, your emotional distress, the media attention, is the fault of these officers? You don't think you might be overreacting?" Alana's anger flared. But she held her composure. "I'm not overreacting. I'm here because no one should have to feel like I did that night, like they're less than human just because of who they are." The courtroom fell silent, the weight of her words hanging in the air. She met the defense lawyer's gaze, unflinching. For a moment, he looked away, visibly rattled, and the confidence he had tried to project faltered. As Alana stepped down from the witness stand, she felt a swell of pride. She had spoken her truth, and the crowd in the courtroom seemed moved, their faces reflecting a mixture of admiration and sadness. But the defense didn't relent. They shifted their focus, calling witnesses to testify on behalf of Officers Reed and Collins. One by one, colleagues and superiors of the officers took the stand, attempting to paint them as dedicated public servants who had merely made a tough call. The police chief even appeared, giving a carefully prepared statement, emphasizing the officers' integrity and commitment to public safety. It was a calculated move, an attempt to humanize the officers and frame the incident as an unfortunate misstep in otherwise spotless careers. But Lila was prepared. With each witness, she and her team dug deeper, highlighting inconsistencies, patterns, and records that exposed a troubling history of complaints and disciplinary actions that had been quietly swept under the rug. The turning point came when they introduced a former officer, a man named Jackson, who had resigned from the force after facing pressure to ignore incidents of misconduct. Nervous but resolute, Jackson recounted how he had witnessed a pattern of discriminatory behavior within the precinct, a culture that enabled officers like Reed and Collins to act without fear of consequences. The truth is, it wasn't just one bad decision. Jackson testified, his voice steady but tinged with bitterness. It was an unspoken rule that certain people were treated as problems, as threats, without cause. I left because I couldn't be part of a system that turned a blind eye to that. The courtroom was silent, every word sinking in as Jackson spoke. Alana watched, her heart swelling with a strange mix of relief and sorrow. Here was someone who had seen the truth, who had left everything behind to speak out against the very system that had wronged her. After Jackson's testimony, murmurs spread through the audience. The jury shifted in their seats, their faces showing a glimmer of doubt. It was clear that the case was no longer just about Alana, it was about a pattern, a culture, a history of unchecked prejudice. In the following days, the case continued to unfold, and Lila's arguments grew only more powerful. She called on experts in civil rights, psychologists who spoke about the long-term trauma that Alana and others like her had experienced, and activists who highlighted the need for systemic change. By the end of each day, Alana felt drained, but she knew they were making progress. Meanwhile, outside the courtroom, the community rallied around them. People gathered in front of the courthouse, holding signs, chanting for justice. Alana's story had become a rallying cry for the countless people who had faced discrimination and mistreatment. Supporters wore buttons with her name. Others painted murals on city walls depicting her standing tall, a symbol of resilience. One evening, as the trial neared its end, Alana and her mother walked out of the courthouse, flanked by reporters. A young girl, no more than 10 years old, slipped through the crowd and approached Alana, clutching a small bouquet of flowers. Alana knelt down, smiling softly. "Hi there. What's your name?" "Jasmine," the girl whispered, looking at her with wide, admiring eyes. "You're really brave." Alana's heart melted as she accepted the flowers, touched beyond words. "Thank you, Jasmine," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "And you're really brave too, coming here to support me." Jasmine nodded, her small face serious. "My mom said you're fighting for all of us. I wanted to say thank you." As Jasmine hugged her tightly, Alana felt the weight of the moment. She realized that this fight was no longer just about her, it was about every child like Jasmine. Every person who had been treated as less than. Every individual who had been ignored. The fight had grown, and she was ready to see it through. Back in the courtroom, the defense made a final attempt to sway the jury, emphasizing that the officers had simply followed procedure, that they had acted in good faith. But their arguments rang hollow, overshadowed by the mountain of evidence Lila had presented, by the courage of Jackson's testimony, and by Alana's own quiet, unbreakable resilience. Finally, in her closing argument, Lila stood before the jury, her voice calm but charged with conviction. "This case has shown us what happens when power is misused, when people are treated as problems instead of as human beings. My daughter, Alana, was humiliated, demeaned, and mistreated simply for existing in a way that didn't fit certain expectations. But Alana is not alone. She represents every person who has ever been made to feel invisible, unwanted, or lesser because of who they are. This is about justice, not just for Alana, but for everyone who has been hurt by a system that protects those in power over those in need." The room was silent, the weight of her words settling over everyone present. Alana looked around, seeing the impact her mother's words had made on each face, feeling the power of this shared moment. As the jury left to deliberate, Alana held her mother's hand, feeling a sense of closure, of peace. They had done everything they could. And now, whatever the verdict, they knew they had brought about change. They had sparked a fire that wouldn't be easily extinguished. After hours of tense waiting, the jury returned. Their decision was unanimous. The officers were found guilty of misconduct and abuse of power. The courtroom erupted, a wave of relief and joy sweeping over Alana as supporters cheered, hugged, and celebrated the victory. It was more than a legal win, it was a win for justice. A step toward a world where people like her didn't have to live in fear. In the days that followed, reforms were announced in the police department. Training programs were implemented, policies revised, and a new wave of accountability swept through the precinct. And at the center of it all was Alana, a young woman who had stood up, spoken out, and refused to be silenced. This victory marked the beginning of a new chapter. Not just for Alana and her mother, but for everyone who had been inspired by their courage. Together, they had proven that change was possible, that justice was worth fighting for, and that, even in the darkest times, resilience could light the way forward. The moment the verdict was announced, Alana felt a surge of emotions: relief, pride, and a deep, almost indescribable sense of justice. The courtroom buzzed with energy, supporters clapping and cheering while the media captured every angle of the historic moment. For Alana, however, the victory was intensely personal. A vindication of the courage it had taken to stand up, to be heard, and to push back against those who had tried to diminish her. As she and her mother left the courthouse, cameras flashed and microphones crowded around them, reporters eager for statements. Lila placed a steady hand on her daughter's shoulder, signaling for silence as she addressed the crowd. "We are grateful for this verdict," Lila began, her voice clear and strong. "But this is only the beginning. My daughter was humiliated and hurt, not just by individuals, but by a system that allowed this behavior to go unchecked. This verdict is a step toward accountability. But true justice means preventing this from happening again. It means creating a system that values and protects every person equally." Alana felt a surge of pride as her mother spoke, knowing that her fight was not just about this one moment, it was about creating change that would ripple far beyond this courthouse, this city, and even this generation. Over the following days, the impact of the trial became clear. The police department announced sweeping changes, including a new training program on racial bias and sensitivity, a civilian oversight committee, and a commitment to more transparent disciplinary procedures. The officers involved were stripped of their positions. And for the first time, the precinct's leadership publicly acknowledged the need for reform. Yet, despite the department's promises, Alana knew this wasn't the end. She felt a responsibility, a calling even, to make sure the changes were real, lasting, and impactful. She began speaking at community meetings, sharing her story and encouraging others to share theirs. Each time she stood in front of a crowd, she could feel the atmosphere shift, her words resonating deeply, breaking down walls of fear and silence that had held people back for too long. Alana also worked alongside her mother and a coalition of community leaders to draft a series of recommendations for local police reform, addressing issues of accountability, diversity, and transparency. They pushed for regular audits, better training, and the establishment of safe reporting mechanisms for individuals to file complaints without fear of retaliation. Over time, these recommendations transformed into policies, each a small step toward rebuilding trust between the police and the community they served. But it wasn't only the public that was inspired by Alana's courage, her friends, family, And even strangers began to reach out, each with stories of their own. Messages flooded her inbox, notes of support, stories of resilience, and expressions of solidarity from people who felt seen and validated by her stand. One day, while she was at a community event, a woman approached her, holding the hand of a young boy who clung shyly to his mother's side. The woman introduced herself as Monica, a single mother who had faced her own struggles with discrimination. "Alana," Monica said, her voice thick with emotion. "You don't know me, but I just wanted to thank you. I've seen what you did, what you went through, and it's given me strength. My son, Gabriel, he looks up to you. You've shown us that we don't have to stay silent, that we deserve to be treated with respect. Thank you for giving us all hope." Alana knelt down to Gabriel's level, smiling warmly. "Hi, Gabriel. You know, you can be anything you want to be. Don't ever let anyone make you feel small." Gabriel nodded, a small smile breaking through his shyness. Alana felt a rush of purpose as she stood, realizing that her story had transcended her personal experience. She had become a symbol of resilience for countless people who had once felt voiceless. As weeks turned into months, Alana continued her work, attending rallies, speaking at schools, and joining panels on police reform and racial justice. Her story was featured in local newspapers and even caught the attention of national outlets, bringing her message to an even wider audience. The impact was undeniable. More people came forward with their stories. More voices joined the call for justice. And the community, once fragmented by fear, began to unite in solidarity. Alana's journey was not without challenges. However, there were detractors, people who questioned her intentions, who doubted the sincerity of her mission, who even accused her of seeking fame. At times, the backlash felt overwhelming, a reminder of the obstacles still standing in her path. But each time the doubt crept in, Alana remembered the faces of those she'd met along the way, the young girl who had given her flowers, the mother who thanked her, and the countless others who had found courage in her story. Her mother, too, remained by her side, offering guidance, wisdom, and strength. Lila continued her own fight for justice from the bench, her rulings and speeches reflecting the same unwavering commitment to equality that she had instilled in Alana. The two became a formidable duo, known for their integrity and their relentless pursuit of change. One day, nearly a year after the trial, Alana was invited to speak at a conference on civil rights and police reform. As she took the stage, she looked out at the packed auditorium, hundreds of faces, all watching her with a mixture of admiration and hope. She took a deep breath, allowing the weight of the moment to settle over her. "A year ago," she began, "I was just a young woman trying to live her life. I didn't want to be in the spotlight, and I certainly didn't want to be anyone's symbol. But life doesn't always give us a choice. Sometimes, we have to face what's in front of us, not just for ourselves, but for everyone who feels unseen, unheard, and misunderstood." She paused, her voice growing stronger. "What happened to me wasn't an isolated incident. It was the result of a system that has failed too many people for too long. But we have the power to change that. We can create a world where everyone, no matter their race, background, or beliefs, can walk down the street without fear, without prejudice, without being made to feel less than human." The room erupted in applause, a standing ovation that seemed to reverberate through the walls. Alana felt a surge of emotion, her heart full, her purpose clear. She had found her calling, not just as an advocate, but as a voice for those who needed one, as a force for change that would inspire generations to come. In the years that followed, Alana's influence only grew. She became a prominent figure in the fight for civil rights. Her story a case study in resilience and transformation. The policies she had helped implement in her city became models for reform in other places. Her work sparking a movement that extended far beyond her hometown. But for Alana, the greatest reward was the knowledge that her journey had created a safer, fairer world for people like Gabriel, Monica, and so many others. She had taken her pain and transformed it into power, her suffering into strength, her silence into a voice that could not be ignored. And as she looked back on the journey, she realized that her story, her mother's story, their shared struggle, had become a legacy of justice. A testament to the power of resilience and the unbreakable spirit of those who dared to stand against the darkness and demand to be seen years past. But the impact of Alana's journey only grew deeper, resonating in her community and far beyond. What had started as a personal fight for justice had transformed into a movement, igniting conversations about equity, compassion, and accountability. Policies were implemented, education initiatives flourished, and community leaders worked together, using Alana's case as a catalyst for systemic change. Alana herself continued her work, becoming a well-respected advocate, speaker, and community organizer. She founded an organization dedicated to supporting individuals who faced similar injustices, providing them with legal resources, support networks, and guidance. The organization quickly became a refuge and a voice for those who felt silenced by the system. Her story was published in articles, documentaries, and books, studied by students and lawmakers alike. But despite her growing influence, Alana remained grounded, always reminding herself that her work was about more than her own story. It was about the countless lives touched by her experience, each one a part of the collective fight for a better world. Alana's mother, Judge Lila Harrington, watched her daughter's journey with a mixture of pride and awe. Now approaching retirement, Lila reflected on her years on the bench, grateful to see her daughter carrying forward her values. She knew that Alana's story was more than a legacy, it was a promise to future generations that justice and equality were possible. One evening, after a long day of meetings and events, Alana sat in her office, surrounded by the photos and letters she had collected over the years. Each letter told a story, people who had been inspired to speak up, communities that had implemented new policies, young people who had found courage because of her journey. She ran her fingers over the letters, feeling the weight of each person's struggle and triumph. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. She looked up to see a young girl standing shyly in the doorway, clutching a folder tightly against her chest. Alana smiled warmly and invited her in. "Hi, Ms. Williams," the girl said, her voice barely a whisper. "My name's Maya. I wanted to thank you for everything you've done." Alana's heart swelled with emotion as she listened to Maya's story. The girl explained how she had experienced bullying at school because of her race, how she had struggled with self-esteem and felt powerless to defend herself. But when she had learned about Alana's story, something shifted within her. "You taught me that I don't have to be afraid to be myself," Maya said, her eyes shining with gratitude. "You showed me that my voice matters." Alana felt tears prick her eyes as she reached out, placing a reassuring hand on Maya's shoulder. "Thank you for telling me that, Maya," she said softly. "And remember, you have so much strength inside you. You're braver than you know." The encounter left Alana with a renewed sense of purpose, a reminder that the work she was doing was reaching people who needed it most. The fight was far from over, but each new generation, like Maya's, was stepping forward with courage, ready to build on the foundations Alana had helped lay. The years passed, and Alana's legacy continued to grow. Her organization expanded, opening branches in cities across the country, each one dedicated to promoting justice, unity, and understanding. Her work inspired others to speak out, creating a ripple effect of change that reached schools, workplaces, and communities. In her personal life, Alana also found happiness. She met someone who shared her values and passion for change, a partner who supported her work and believed in her vision. Together, they built a life centered on love, purpose, and resilience. Her family grew, and she became a mother herself, instilling in her children the same values her own mother had taught her: strength, compassion, and an unwavering belief in justice. Judge Lila Harrington retired, but her influence continued through Alana. Whenever Lila saw her daughter on the news or read an article about her latest achievement, she felt a deep sense of fulfillment. She knew she had not only raised a daughter but had inspired a movement, one that would endure for generations. In her final public speech before her retirement, Lila addressed a gathering of young people, community leaders, and supporters. "What my daughter taught me, and what I hope to pass on to all of you," she said, her voice filled with warmth, "is that justice is not just about laws or policies. It's about the courage to stand up, to speak out, and to demand better, not just for ourselves, but for everyone. That's the legacy we leave behind." Alana, sitting in the front row, watched her mother with tears in her eyes, overwhelmed with gratitude. She knew that everything she had accomplished was rooted in her mother's teachings, in the love and strength that had carried her through even the darkest moments. As the years passed, Alana's story became a lasting part of her community's history, a beacon of hope and resilience. Schools taught her story, reminding young people that they, too, had the power to make a difference. Public murals commemorated her journey, and scholarships were established in her name to support students committed to social justice. Alana never forgot where it had all started, kneeling on the cold pavement, her dignity stripped away, her humanity questioned. She had taken that pain, that injustice, and turned it into something powerful, something lasting. And as she looked back on her life, she knew that her story was not just her own. It belonged to everyone who had ever been made to feel small, to everyone who had ever doubted their worth. Her life had become a testament to the power of resilience, a reminder that even the smallest voice could create echoes of change. One afternoon, many years later, Alana returned to the very street corner where her story had begun. She stood there, feeling the weight of all that had happened, of the lives touched, of the legacy she had built. As she looked around at the city she loved, she felt a deep sense of peace. The world was still imperfect, still flawed, but it was changing, and she had been a part of that change. A plaque stood nearby, commemorating her story and the movement it had inspired. Inscribed were her words, a message to the world: justice is not a gift, it is a right. And every voice raised, every heart determined, every life dedicated to that truth moves us closer to the world we all deserve. With a quiet smile, Alana placed her hand on the plaque, feeling the cool metal under her fingers. She knew that her story, her mother's story, and the stories of countless others would continue to inspire, to challenge, to uplift. And as she walked away, she felt a sense of purpose renewed, a legacy she had fought for, a world she had helped shape, and a future that